The year is 1789. Paris, a city of stark contrasts, simmered under the oppressive heat of a late July sun, its cobblestone streets echoing with the clamor of revolution. The air, thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, stale wine, and burgeoning rebellion, hung heavy over the sprawling metropolis. For weeks the Bastille had fallen, a symbolic crack in the foundation of the old regime, and the people, once cowering, now roared with a newfound, terrifying power. Amidst this volatile atmosphere, a young man named Antoine Dubois navigated the labyrinthine alleyways of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, his gaze wary, his heart a drum against his ribs. Antoine was a printer's apprentice, his hands perpetually stained with ink, his mind sharp, despite his humble origins. He was an observer, a quiet chronicler of the city's grim transformation. He'd seen the hunger in the eyes of the poor, the fear in the faces of the aristocracy, and the fanatical glint in the eyes of the revolutionaries. Today, however, a different kind of dread gnawed at him. His master, an elderly man named Jean-Pierre, had vanished. Not merely disappeared, but evaporated, leaving behind a half-printed pamphlet and a disturbing, lingering silence. The printing shop, nestled in a narrow, shadowed street, usually buzzed with the rhythmic clatter of the press and the low hum of conversation. Now, it was eerily quiet, the silence amplified by the distant roar of the Parisian crowds. Antoine pushed open the creaking wooden door, a shiver tracing its way down his spine despite the warmth. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light filtering through the grimy windows, illuminating the abandoned workspace. A faint, metallic smell, something beyond mere ink, pricked at his nostrils. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unsettling nonetheless. He called out, "Maître Jean-Pierre." His voice, usually steady, wavered. No response. He checked the back room, a small living space where Jean-Pierre slept, but it too was empty. The bed was unmade, a half-eaten loaf of bread sat on a small table, hardened and forgotten. This wasn't like his master. Jean-Pierre was meticulous, a creature of habit. His sudden absence was a gaping wound in the familiar fabric of Antoine's life. As he re-entered the main shop, his eyes fell upon a small, crumpled piece of paper tucked beneath a loose floorboard near the press. It wasn't a note, or at least not one he could immediately decipher. It was a crude drawing, a stylized, almost childlike depiction of a guillotine, but with an unnerving twist. The blade, instead of being a simple triangle, was intricately detailed, resembling a serpent's fang. And beneath it, a series of indecipherable symbols. A cold knot formed in Antoine's stomach. He tucked the drawing into his pocket, his mind racing. Was this connected to Jean-Pierre's disappearance? The old man had always been careful, avoiding political entanglements, yet his pamphlets often carried a subtle, subversive undertone, championing the common man's plight. Could he have crossed someone, perhaps an influential radical, or worse, a remaining loyalist? The thought sent a jolt of fear through him. In these times, a wrong word could mean the difference between life and death. Antoine decided to seek help. His only confidant in this tumultuous city was Elise, a young seamstress who lived a few streets away. She was sharp, resourceful, and possessed a keen understanding of the city's undercurrents. As he stepped back into the bustling street, the sounds of the revolution seemed to amplify, the shouts of "Liberté, égalité, fraternité," carrying an unsettling edge. He passed by impromptu soapbox orators, their faces contorted with revolutionary fervor, their words dripping with promises of a new dawn and threats of bloody retribution for those who resisted. The air crackled with a dangerous energy. He reached Elise's small atelier, the scent of fresh linen and simmering herbs offering a brief respite from the city's oppressive aroma. He found her hunched over a piece of delicate lace, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her dark hair, usually neatly braided, had escaped its confines, framing a face smudged with fatigue. "Elise," Antoine said, his voice hushed. She looked up, her eyes, the color of warm honey, widening slightly in surprise. "Antoine, what brings you here at such an hour?" You look as if you've seen a ghost." He quickly recounted Jean-Pierre's disappearance and the strange drawing. Elise listened intently, her needle momentarily forgotten. When he finished, she ran a hand through her hair, a thoughtful frown on her face. "A guillotine with a serpent's fang," she mused. "And symbols? This is, disquieting." Jean-Pierre was a man of principles, but he was also careful. To vanish without a trace, but it's not like him. "Exactly," Antoine agreed, his voice tight. "I fear something terrible has happened. The metallic smell, I can't shake it." Elise stood up, pacing the small room. "The city is a cauldron, Antoine. People are disappearing every day, accused of treason, of being enemies of the people. But Jean-Pierre? He was no firebrand. He merely printed what he was asked, and sometimes he'd slip in a subtle message of hope for the common folk. Perhaps that was enough," Antoine suggested darkly. "Perhaps that was too much." "We need to be careful," Elise warned, her gaze sharp. "The revolutionary committees are everywhere. Accusations fly like daggers. But we can't simply do nothing." Jean-Pierre was a good man. She led him to a small map of Paris, spread on a table in the corner, usually used for plotting delivery routes. Where was he last seen? Did he mention any unusual meetings, any new clients? Antoine thought hard. He did mention a new client, a man who spoke in riddles, who insisted on meeting late at night. Jean-Pierre said he was a scholar, interested in obscure historical texts. He never gave a name, only referred to him as the Collector. Elise's eyes narrowed. The Collector. Sounds like a character from a fable. Did he say where these meetings took place? Only that they were in a place of old knowledge, somewhere near the university district, Antoine replied, a flicker of hope igniting within him. He said the man was strangely fascinated by old instruments, especially those with intricate mechanisms. A place of old knowledge, near the university, with a fascination for intricate mechanisms. The description, vague as it was, sparked a connection in Elise's mind. There's an old abandoned alchemist's workshop, not far from the Sorbonne. It's been left to rot for decades, rumored to be haunted, but it's filled with all manner of ancient contraptions. It might fit the description. An alchemist's workshop? Antoine questioned, a skeptical eyebrow raised. Surely Jean-Pierre wouldn't meet someone there. In these times, people meet in the strangest places to avoid prying eyes, Elise countered. It's a long shot, but it's the only lead we have. We should go there, tonight, after dark. It's too dangerous to wander the streets in broad daylight, attracting attention. As darkness descended upon Paris, a shroud of uncertainty enveloping the city, Antoine and Elise made their way towards the university district. The gas lamps, sparsely lit due to the rationing and chaos, cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to twist and writhe with malevolent intent. The city's usual nocturnal symphony of street vendors and merrymakers was replaced by a more ominous sound. The distant rhythmic thud of a drum, a precursor to the public executions that had become a grim spectacle in the city. They kept to the darker alleys, their footsteps muffled by the grimy cobblestones. The air grew colder, a damp chill seeping into their bones, a stark contrast to the day's oppressive heat. The sense of foreboding intensified with every step. Antoine clutched the crumpled drawing in his pocket, the serpent-fang guillotine feeling heavier than lead. He couldn't shake the image of his kind, gentle master, caught in the clutches of this escalating madness. Finally, they arrived at a dilapidated building, its stone facade crumbling, ivy clawing its way up the walls like skeletal fingers. The windows were boarded shut, but a faint flickering light emanated from within a crack in one of the lower shutters. A shiver of apprehension ran through Antoine. This was it. "Careful now," Elise whispered, her hand gripping his arm. "We don't know who or what is inside." They found a rusted iron-wrought gate, barely hanging on its hinges. With a gentle push, it groaned open, revealing a small, overgrown courtyard. The air here was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay, mingling with the metallic scent Antoine had noticed in the print shop. It was stronger now, undeniably present. A low, rhythmic thrumming sound, almost like a heartbeat, vibrated through the ground beneath their feet. Antoine's heart pounded. This was more than just an abandoned workshop. This felt alive and profoundly menacing. He pulled out the drawing, his eyes scanning the crude symbols beneath the serpent-fang guillotine. He had a chilling premonition that they were about to uncover something far more sinister than a simple disappearance, something that would challenge the very notion of justice and humanity in a city consumed by its own revolution. The thrumming sound grew louder as Antoine and Elise crept across the overgrown courtyard, the soles of their worn boots crunching on ancient gravel. The air, heavy with the stench of rust and something acrid, felt thick and difficult to breathe. They moved toward the faint light emanating from a cracked window, their senses on high alert. Antoine peered through the gap, his breath fogging the glass. Inside, the scene was a chilling tableau. The room was not empty, but filled with a dizzying array of bizarre and intricate contraptions. Brass tubes twisted like metal serpents, connecting glass spheres filled with dark, bubbling liquids. Glimmering gears, some no larger than a fingernail, others the size of a man's hand, were scattered across wooden workbenches. And at the center of it all, bathed in the amber glow of a single oil lamp, stood a man. He was tall and gaunt, his face a mask of intense concentration. His long, aristocratic fingers, devoid of dirt or grime, moved with a horrifying precision over a small metallic device. He hummed a tuneless, unsettling melody under his breath, a sound that made the hairs on Antoine's neck stand on end. As the man turned, the light caught his face, and Antoine felt a cold wave of recognition. It was a face he had seen before, not in person, but in the detailed, almost obsessive sketches Jean-Pierre had made in his private journal. The face of the collector. He was not a man of academia, as Jean-Pierre had suggested, but a man of obsession. His eyes, a pale, almost milky blue, were fixed on his work with a fervent, unblinking intensity. He was meticulously assembling a miniature version of a guillotine. The tiny, perfectly crafted blade was indeed shaped like a serpent's fang, a gruesome detail that mirrored the drawing Antoine had found. Beside the man's workbench, a dark, heavy sack lay on the floor. A tremor of dread ran through Antoine. What was inside? He gripped Elise's hand, his knuckles white. She squeezed back, a silent warning to remain still. The collector, as if sensing their presence, suddenly stopped humming. He straightened, his head cocked to one side. He didn't look toward the window, but toward the entrance, a slow, unnerving smile spreading across his lips. "I know you're there," he said, his voice a low, melodic baritone. "The air changed when you arrived. It became younger, fearful." Elise pulled Antoine back from the window. The game had changed. They were no longer observers. They were the hunted. "We need to go," she whispered urgently. But as they turned to flee, a deep, resonant thump echoed from behind them. They spun around to see a figure emerging from the shadows of the courtyard's archway. It was a man, short and stocky, with a face like a bulldog, and a brutish, menacing scowl. He held a thick, heavy bludgeon, its end wrapped in rags. "Looking for a little tour?" The man grunted, his voice a gravelly rumble. "No, we're lost," Antoine said, his voice shaky, a desperate attempt to appear innocent. The brutish man laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Lost? In the old collector's nest? Don't be fools. I saw you watching. You saw him. That means you know too much." He took a menacing step forward, raising the bludgeon. Elise, quick-witted as always, reacted instantly. She kicked a loose paving stone, sending it skittering across the courtyard with a loud scrape. The noise, jarring in the oppressive silence, momentarily distracted the brute. In that instant, Antoine grabbed Elise's hand and they bolted, their hearts pounding in their ears. They burst out of the courtyard and into the dark alley, the brutish man's enraged shouts fading behind them. They ran, not caring where they were going, their only goal to put as much distance as possible between themselves and that horrifying workshop. They didn't stop until they reached a small, forgotten square, the air no longer thick with the stench of decay but with the faint, familiar scent of wood smoke. Panting, they leaned against a cold stone fountain, their limbs trembling. "He knew," Antoine gasped. "He knew we were there." "He's not just a collector," Elise said, her voice tight with fear. "He's a madman, and that brute, a hired thug, no doubt." They realized the full gravity of their situation. Jean-Pierre wasn't a victim of random revolutionary violence, he was a target. And now, they were too. The drawing, the symbols, the metallic smell, and the man they now knew to be the collector, all of it pointed to a chilling, orchestrated plot. Back at Elise's small apartment, they felt a fragile sense of security. The silence inside was a stark contrast to the city's turmoil, but it was a silence filled with a new kind of terror. Antoine took out the crumpled drawing, laying it flat on a table. The symbols beneath the serpent-fang guillotine seemed to mock them, their meaning a frustrating, impenetrable puzzle. "What do you think they mean?" Elise asked, tracing the strange shapes with a careful finger. Antoine shook his head. "I don't know. They're not French, not Latin, nothing I've ever seen. But the guillotine, the serpent's fang, it's not a common design. This is personal. He's not just killing people, he's doing something with them." The word killing hung in the air between them, unspoken but heavy with dread. They knew in their hearts that Jean-Pierre was almost certainly dead. The metallic smell, the sack, the collector's obsessive work with the miniature guillotine. It all painted a gruesome picture. Elise had an idea. "My grandfather, before he passed, was a scholar. He was obsessed with old languages, with symbols and codes. He left me his library. Maybe, just maybe, there's something there that can help us." They spent the rest of the night poring over dusty leather-bound books in Elise's grandfather's library. The books, many of them centuries old, smelled of ancient paper and forgotten knowledge. They were filled with strange scripts and arcane drawings, but nothing matched the symbols on Antoine's drawing. As dawn painted the sky a pale grey, a new kind of exhaustion settled over them. They had found nothing. Just as they were about to give up, Antoine noticed a small, unmarked book tucked away on a lower shelf. It was bound in rough, dark leather and had no title. He pulled it out, and as he opened it, a small, loose parchment fell out. It was a map, not of Paris, but of a specific building, with a series of cryptic notes scribbled in the margins. And at the center of the map, a symbol, identical to one on his drawing, marked a specific room. Elise's eyes widened. "That's the Paris asylum," she said, her voice a hushed whisper. "The old one, the one the monarchy built. It's been abandoned for years. Why would that symbol be there? The Paris asylum, a place of forgotten souls and dark history." The very name sent a chill down Antoine's spine. It was a place everyone in Paris knew about, a place of rumors and whispered fears, a place where the city's most troubled and inconvenient people were sent to vanish. The map showed a series of interlocking tunnels beneath the asylum, leading to a hidden chamber. The notes spoke of the Great Device and the Final Sacrament. This wasn't just about Jean-Pierre anymore. It was about something much larger, a conspiracy that had been brewing in the heart of Paris long before the revolution had begun. The collector wasn't just a madman. He was a key figure in something truly terrifying. The symbols weren't a random scroll. They were a blueprint. And the guillotine with the serpent's fang was not a fantasy, but a real and likely monstrous machine. The puzzle was beginning to fit together, but the picture it formed was one of pure horror. They were at the edge of a precipice, about to step into a darkness that had been carefully hidden beneath the veneer of revolution. They had to be careful. The collector was watching. He had a brutish accomplice, and they were, in this moment, the only ones who knew of his macabre secret. Their search for a friend had just turned into a fight for their lives, and the fate of who knew how many others. The old Paris asylum loomed on the outskirts of the city, a hulking, skeletal structure against the bruised morning sky. Its stone walls, once a symbol of institutional authority, now bore the scars of neglect and decay. Windows were shattered, ivy had reclaimed the once manicured grounds, and a palpable sense of abandonment hung in the stagnant air. Rumors of the asylum were many and dark, tales of inhumane treatments and forgotten souls, a place where sanity was lost and never recovered. Antoine and Elise stood a safe distance away, concealed behind a crumbling brick wall. The map, now a sacred artifact, was clutched in Antoine's hand. It showed a hidden entrance, a forgotten service tunnel that led directly to the asylum's underbelly, an area that never appeared on any official records. "This feels wrong," Antoine whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant rumble of a passing cart. Going inside. "It's a death trap." Elise's gaze was fixed on the desolate building. "It's our only chance to understand what's happening. Jean-Pierre would have wanted us to. We can't let him vanish into this madness." Her resolve was a steady flame against Antoine's fear. They found the entrance exactly where the map indicated, a cleverly concealed stone panel hidden behind a thicket of overgrown weeds. It took both of their combined strength to push the heavy slab aside, revealing a gaping maw of darkness. A gust of stale, earthy air, heavy with the scent of damp stone and something else, something metallic and cold, wafted out. They lit a small oil lamp, its flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls of the tunnel. The air was thick with dust and the oppressive weight of time. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for them to walk side by side, its low ceiling forcing them to hunch. The silence was absolute, save for the echo of their own footsteps and the drip of water somewhere in the darkness. As they ventured deeper, the tunnel sloped downwards. The temperature dropped, and the air grew colder, the metallic smell stronger. The walls, once rough stone, became smoother, a strange, unnatural surface that felt slick to the touch. The path was marked by the same strange symbols from the drawing, crudely etched into the walls at regular intervals, a chilling breadcrumb trail, leading them to their destination. "He's been here," Antoine said, his voice a strained whisper. "The collector. He's been here before. This isn't a new plan. It's something that's been in the works for a long, long time." The realization was a punch to the gut. This wasn't a sudden act of madness. It was a meticulously planned, long-term project. The collector was not a man who simply killed. He was a man with a purpose, a terrible, calculated purpose. The tunnel finally opened into a vast, cavernous space. It was not a natural cave, but a massive, man-made chamber, its ceiling supported by a series of immense stone arches. The air here was even colder, and the metallic smell was now overpowering, a cloying, coppery stench that turned Antoine's stomach. And then they saw it. At the center of the chamber, bathed in the sickly light of several oil lamps, was the great device. It was a guillotine, but unlike any they had ever seen. It was a monstrous, beautiful and terrifying thing, made of polished brass and gleaming steel, its frame intricately carved with interlocking serpents. Its blade, instead of a simple triangle, was shaped into the exact serpent's fang from the drawing, its polished surface catching the light with a malevolent glint. The symbols from the drawing were etched not just on the walls, but into the very metal of the device, a chilling signature. But it wasn't just a guillotine, it was a machine. A series of complex gears, pulleys, and intricate mechanisms extended from its base, connecting to a large circular chamber built into the floor. The chamber was surrounded by a network of brass tubes, which led away into the darkness, disappearing into the walls. The thrumming sound they had heard outside was now a low, continuous hum, emanating from the machine itself, a sound of dormant, terrible power. Beside the device, a small table was covered with what looked like medical instruments, scalpels, syringes, and strange, archaic tools Antoine had never seen before. A journal lay open, its pages filled with the same meticulous handwriting as Jean-Pierre's sketches, but the content was chillingly different. They were diagrams, Not of printing presses, but of human anatomy, of blood flow, of nerve endings, and of the human mind itself. "This is not for execution," Elise breathed, her voice filled with horrified realization. "This is a machine for something else, something unspeakable." A sudden sound shattered the silence. A low, groaning voice echoed from a dark corner of the chamber. "Ah, the children arrive. I was hoping you would." The brutish man from the courtyard stepped out of the shadows, his heavy bludgeon gripped in his hand. He was not alone. Behind him stood the collector, his pale eyes glinting in the lamplight, a cold smile on his face. "So predictable," the collector said, his voice a soft purr. "The apprentice so loyal to his master. The girl so quick to follow, a charming but naive pair." "Where is Jean-Pierre?" Antoine demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. The collector's smile widened. He gestured to a chair near the guillotine. "He is here, in a way. He was a difficult subject, I must admit. So much defiance. But his mind was a masterpiece, a beautiful tapestry of knowledge. It would have been a waste to simply let it go to waste." He walked over to a small brass lever near the device and pulled it. The thrumming intensified, a low mechanical growl filling the chamber. A section of the circular chamber in the floor slid open, revealing a clear glass cylinder filled with a swirling, viscous liquid. And within it, suspended in the murky depths, was a perfectly preserved human brain. Antoine's legs gave way. The face of the person was unrecognizable, but the brain, the intricate folds and convolutions, was distinct. He recognized it from Jean-Pierre's journal, from the sketches of his own mind. The collector hadn't just killed him. He had taken his mind. "He was my first successful transfer," the collector said, his voice filled with a chilling pride. "1,000 heads, 1,000 minds. That is my true legacy. This revolution, this chaos, it is merely the harvest. 1,000 minds, 1,000 thoughts, 1,000 lives, all to be distilled and preserved. And with his knowledge, his wisdom, I will be able to perfect my work." He had not built a machine of death, but a machine of preservation. He had been harvesting minds, a gruesome and horrifying undertaking. The serpent's fang, the intricate mechanisms, they weren't for a swift, humane execution. They were for something far, far more terrible. The brutish man took a step forward, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "They've seen the work, master. What do we do with them?" "Why, the same as the others," the collector said, his gaze fixed on Antoine and Elise, a chilling, almost paternalistic kindness in his eyes. "They are young, fresh minds, full of fear and despair. A perfect new vintage for my collection." Antoine's mind reeled. They were trapped, caught in the clutches of a madman who saw people not as human beings, but as a harvest, a collection of minds to be preserved for his own twisted purpose. The guillotine wasn't an instrument of justice, but a macabre scientific tool. The revolution, the chaos, the fear, it was all a cover, a fertile ground for his horrific project. They had stumbled upon a secret far more disturbing than a simple murder. They had uncovered a conspiracy of pure, unadulterated madness, and they were about to become its next subjects. The brutish man, whose name Antoine now knew to be Gaspard, advanced with a heavy, purposeful tread, his bludgeon raised. Elise, ever the pragmatist, was already scanning the cavernous chamber for an escape route. Her eyes darted from the tall arches to the shadows, but there was nowhere to run. The collector, standing by his monstrous device, watched them with the cold, detached interest of a scientist observing specimens. "Don't make this difficult," Gaspard grunted, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. "The master's work is precise, but it's not without a few unpleasantries." Fear coiled in Antoine's gut, but a flicker of his master's defiance ignited within him. He was a printer, a man who dealt in words and ideas. He knew how to distract, how to create a narrative. "You call this precision? You're a grave robber, a monster." He spat at the collector. You prey on the chaos of the revolution, a scavenger of souls. The collector's serene expression didn't waver. Every great artist requires the proper materials, my boy. And the human mind, in all its complexity, is the most beautiful material of all. As the collector spoke, Elise's gaze fell upon a stack of discarded mechanical parts near one of the arches. An idea, half-formed and desperate, flashed in her mind. "He's not a scavenger," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm, directed at Gaspar. "He's a coward, hiding down here, stealing mines because he's afraid to show his face to the city above." Gaspar's face contorted in a rage. He was not a man of intellect, he was a man of brute force, and their words were pricking at his thick skin. "Shut your mouth, girl," he roared, lunging forward. In that split second, Elise acted. She grabbed a heavy, rusty gear from the pile and, with a powerful, desperate throw, hurled it at the closest oil lamp. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, and the flame, fueled by the oil, flared into a sudden inferno, sending a shower of sparks into the dark. The sudden light and heat were disorienting. Gaspar, blinded for a moment, stumbled. Elise, grabbing Antoine's arm, pulled him away from the main chamber and towards a narrow, shadowed passage they hadn't noticed before. It was a ventilation shaft, a small opening near the ceiling barely large enough for them to squeeze through. "Move," she commanded, her voice fierce and low. Antoine scrambled up, his hands scraping against the rough stone walls. He was in, his heart thundering. He reached down and pulled Elise up with him. They heard the furious shouts of Gaspar and the calm, chilling voice of the collector. "Fool, they are still in my grasp," the collector said, his voice now laced with a cold fury. "The tunnels are a maze. They cannot escape." The ventilation shaft was a tight, claustrophobic crawl space. They moved forward, elbowing their way through the narrow passage, the air thick with dust and the smell of ancient stone. The muffled shouts from below faded as they moved deeper into the labyrinthine network. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a large subterranean room. It was an old storage cellar, filled with decaying crates and barrels. The air was cool and musty, a welcome change from the oppressive heat and metallic stench of the collector's chamber. They were safe for now, but not free. The map showed that this section of tunnels was a dead end. They had to find another way out. Antoine's head swam with the horrific image of Jean-Pierre's brain floating in that strange, viscous liquid. The macabre truth of the collector's work had shattered his reality. He wasn't just a murderer. He was a creator of a twisted legacy. "He's not just taking their minds," Elise said, her voice a hushed whisper as if she could read Antoine's thoughts. "He's harvesting their knowledge, their skills, their essence. He wants to build an empire of perfect minds, a new world order based on a stolen foundation." The idea was so terrifying, so audacious, that it made a grim kind of sense. The collector wasn't a product of the revolution. He was a parasite upon it, using the chaos to hide his true purpose. He was a man who wanted to be a god, and he was using the city's upheaval as his bloody, horrific playground. They spent hours exploring the maze of cellar tunnels, their small lamp running low on oil. They found forgotten wine bottles, long decayed food, and artifacts from a life long past. The deeper they went, the more they felt like ghosts in a world of ghosts. Just as their hope began to wane, they stumbled upon a narrow staircase, its wooden steps creaking under their weight. It led up, into the light. With a new burst of energy, they ascended, their footsteps light despite their exhaustion. The staircase opened into the back room of a small, forgotten chapel. It was dark, the only light coming from a stained glass window high above, casting a kaleidoscope of colors on the dusty pews. The chapel was abandoned, its pews covered in white sheets, its altar bare. They were out. They had escaped the tunnels of madness. They slipped out the chapel's front door and into a narrow, bustling street. The sounds of Paris, the shouts of vendors and the cries of children were a welcome, sanity-affirming symphony. But the world looked different now. The revolution, the public executions, the guillotine at the Place de Grève. All of it had a new, sinister meaning. They made their way back to Elise's apartment, the terror of their discovery a silent, heavy weight between them. They were no longer just a printer's apprentice and a seamstress. They were witnesses to a terrible secret, and their silence would make them accomplices. The collector, they knew, would not forget them. He was a predator, and they were his chosen prey. Antoine pulled out the map once more. He had a sudden, terrible thought. The symbol, the one that marked the asylum, it was the first of a series of locations. The map was not just a guide to a single location, it was a blueprint for the collector's entire network. There were other symbols, other places marked, all in different parts of Paris. The asylum was just the first piece of a much larger and much more terrifying puzzle. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The collector had an entire network of these facilities hidden beneath the city's facade. He wasn't just collecting mines, he was building an army of stolen knowledge, 1,000 heads of stolen genius. And they were the only ones who knew. They had to stop him. They had to expose him. But how? How do you expose a man who is hiding in plain sight, a man who is using the city's chaos as his camouflage? The revolution, the very thing that had promised to free the people, had become a tool for a new and far more insidious form of tyranny. The next day, Paris felt like a city of two faces. The public face was a maelstrom of revolutionary fervor. The streets teemed with impassioned orators, tricolor cockades were everywhere, and the guillotine at the Place de Grève loomed as a grim testament to the new order. But beneath this surface of patriotic zeal, Antoine and Elise saw a different, hidden Paris. They saw the shadows, the whispers, the places where people simply vanished. They saw the collector's web, a sinister conspiracy hiding in plain sight. The map was their guide, but also their burden. The next symbol led them to a quiet, unassuming neighborhood near the Luxembourg Palace. The map marked a building, an old, forgotten library. It was not a grand public library, but a private one, its windows barred and its doors locked. The facade was crumbling, and a sign above the entrance read, Bibliothèque de l'Ordre, a name that hinted at a forgotten, perhaps secret, society. They knew they couldn't just break in. The collector would have his people everywhere. They needed a plan, a way to get inside without drawing attention. Elise, using her skills as a seamstress, began crafting a new narrative for them. She made them new clothes, ones that looked a few social rungs above their own station, but not so high as to draw suspicion. They became a pair of well-to-do siblings, visiting Paris from the countryside, a plausible disguise in the chaotic influx of people. They spent the day observing the library. A man, not Gaspard but someone similar in stature, stood guard near the entrance, a nonchalant observer who was anything but. He was a sentinel, his gaze sweeping the street with a predatory stillness. They saw a carriage, a sleek black affair, pull up to a side entrance. A man, dressed in the latest fashions, slipped inside. The collector's network was not just a collection of thugs and madmen. It was a well-organized, well-funded operation, a society of influence and power. "He's not just a lunatic," Antoine whispered, his voice laced with a new understanding. "He's a part of the city's power structure. He's connected. He's using the revolution as a cover, a way to dispose of his subjects without arousing suspicion." "The order," Elise mused, her eyes fixed on the man standing guard. "This isn't just about collecting mines. It's about building a new order, a new kind of power. 1,000 heads, 1,000 minds. They're not just a collection. They're the foundation of his kingdom." That night, under the cover of a light drizzle, they put their plan into action. Elise, using a small, delicate lockpick she had made herself, managed to open a side window of the library. They slipped inside, the air thick with the smell of old paper and dust. The library was not what they expected. It wasn't a place of quiet contemplation, but of feverish, methodical work. The shelves were not filled with novels or poetry, but with meticulously organized rows of journals. Each one had a small, handwritten tag attached. Mind of a master cartographer. Mind of a renowned surgeon. Mind of a political strategist. The tags were like grim labels in a morbid apothecary. And there, in the center of the room, on a large table, was a new, horrifying invention. It was a complex series of tubes and syringes connected to a small, intricate device. It was a mechanism for extraction. This was not the place where the minds were harvested. It was the place where their knowledge was systematically extracted, sorted, and catalogued. "He's not just collecting them," Antoine said, his voice a low, strangled whisper. "He's mapping them. He's turning them into an encyclopedia of human thought." A sudden sound from the back of the room froze them in their tracks. A low, rhythmic clicking. They crept toward the sound and found a small, hidden room. Inside, the collector sat at a desk, his back to them, meticulously transcribing notes from a thick, leather-bound journal. He was writing with a speed and precision that was inhuman, his hand moving without a single pause. And next to him, on a small marble pedestal, was a glass jar filled with that same viscous, murky liquid. A single human brain floated inside. Antoine's heart seized. This brain was different. It was smaller, less convoluted. The tag read, "Mind of a Parisian thief." The collector, as if sensing their presence, stopped writing. He turned, his face a mask of serene calm. "I knew you would come here," he said, his voice a quiet, almost sympathetic tone. "The apprentice, the dutiful one. You have a good mind, Antoine, full of curiosity. You would have made an excellent addition." Gaspard emerged from the shadows behind him, a menacing grin on his face. The other man, the one they had seen earlier, stood guard at the door. They were trapped. The collector had been waiting for them. It was a trap, and they had walked right into it. "You see," the collector said, standing up and walking toward them, his movements slow and deliberate. "The revolution is a crude thing. It is all about base emotions, about the mob. I, on the other hand, am building a new kind of power. The power of pure knowledge, stripped of all its messy, human baggage. 1,000 minds will give me 1,000 skills, 1,000 lifetimes of experience. I will be a god, not of a country, but of pure thought." He gestured to the brain in the jar. "This one was a disappointment. A clever mind for a thief, but not for greatness. But yours, Antoine, and yours, Elise. Yours are minds of defiance. That is a rare and beautiful quality. A perfect blend for my final experiment." The collector took a step closer, his eyes fixed on them with a chilling, possessive gaze. Antoine's mind raced. They had to act. They had to find a weakness, a vulnerability in this man's terrifying facade. But what? What can you do against a man who has an army of thugs and a web of influence that stretched across the city? As the collector neared, Antoine's gaze fell on the meticulous stack of journals. He had an idea, a desperate last-ditch plan. He would hit the collector where it would hurt the most, his precious collection. "What is he going to do with us?" Elise asked, her voice trembling, but her eyes fixed on Antoine with a silent question. She was in on his plan. "What does it matter?" Gaspard grunted, taking another menacing step forward. "You're dead anyway." The collector raised a hand, silencing his brute. "Patience, Gaspard. They need to understand. They are about to become a part of history, a new, unwritten history." As the collector's attention was momentarily diverted, Antoine glanced at Elise. The signal was a silent, frantic nod. They were a team, and they had one shot. They would go for the journals. They would destroy his life's work. The consequences would be terrible, but it was their only weapon against this madman and his web of lies. Antoine and Elise, with a silent, synchronized understanding, broke away from the collector and his thugs. They moved with the frantic energy of cornered animals. Antoine lunged for the table, his hand sweeping across the meticulously stacked journals. He knocked them over, sending them cascading across the floor, their pages fluttering like a flock of terrified birds. Elise, meanwhile, grabbed a bottle of ink from the collector's desk and with a powerful swing smashed it against a shelf. The black liquid spraying across the journals, destroying pages of notes and diagrams. The collector, his mask of serene calm shattering, let out a primal scream of pure, unadulterated fury. "No! My work! My beautiful work!" he shrieked, his voice a high-pitched manic sound. He was no longer a stoic scholar, but a deranged artist whose masterpiece was being defiled. Gaspard, enraged by their defiance, charged at Antoine. He was a bull of a man, his movements fueled by a brutish simplicity. But Antoine, though smaller, was a printer's apprentice. He was quick on his feet, agile and accustomed to working with heavy machinery. He dodged Gaspard's lunge, sidestepping him just as the thug's bludgeon slammed against a heavy bookcase, sending it toppling over with a tremendous crash. The other man, the one guarding the door, was momentarily distracted, his attention split between the chaos and the need to protect the collector. This was their chance. The toppled bookcase had created a barricade, a brief wall between them and their pursuers. Antoine grabbed Elise's hand and they ran, scrambling over the fallen books and splintered wood. They burst out of the back room and into the main part of the library, leaving a trail of ruined journals and spilled ink behind them. The collector, his face a contorted mask of hatred, was behind them, his voice a venomous hiss. "You will not get away. You will pay for this." But they were faster, their desperation a fierce wind at their backs. They found a back door, a heavy oak panel that led to a small enclosed garden. They were out. They had escaped the lair of the beast. But they were now hunted, their faces known, their defiance a mortal sin in the collector's eyes. They found refuge in a small, forgotten church, its ancient walls offering a fragile sense of sanctuary. They were exhausted, their bodies trembling with adrenaline and fear. But their minds were a maelstrom of new questions. Why did the collector have a collection of minds? What was the true purpose of the great device? And who exactly was he? He spoke of an order, of a new kind of power. Was he a part of something larger, something even more sinister than a single madman? "He's not working alone," Elise said, her voice hoarse from fear and exhaustion. "He has an entire network. Thugs, a library, maybe even influence in the government. He's a part of the aristocracy, Antoine. Or at least he was. He's using the revolution to purge the people he wants to get rid of, all to feed his monstrous machine." The thought was a chilling one. The chaos of the revolution, the constant disappearances, the brutal public executions. It was all a convenient cover for this madman's work. He wasn't just collecting minds, he was orchestrating a silent purge, a selective harvesting of the city's intellects. Antoine took out the map. The next symbol, the next location, was a small, unassuming apothecary in a secluded part of the city. Why an apothecary? What could he be doing there? A new, even more terrifying thought gnawed at him. The viscous liquid in which the brains were suspended. It was a preservative. The collector wasn't just collecting minds, he was developing a way to keep them alive, to maintain them. And an apothecary would be the perfect place for a man of science to experiment with such things. The next day, they ventured to the apothecary. It was an old shop, its sign faded and its windows opaque with grime. It looked abandoned, but a faint sweet smell, like a mixture of herbs and something else, something cloying and strange, emanated from within. They entered the shop through a back window, their senses on high alert. The apothecary was not abandoned. It was a functioning lab, but not for traditional medicine. There were beakers and alembics, but they were filled with strange, shimmering liquids. Diagrams of the human brain filled with notes and calculations were pinned to the walls. And in the center of the room, a large, intricate device, a machine with tubes and a pressurized chamber. It was a distillation device. It was here that the viscous liquid was being created. As they examined the device, a low, groaning sound came from a back room. They crept toward the sound, their hearts pounding in their ears. The room was a cell, its walls lined with small glass-fronted containers. Inside each one, suspended in the viscous liquid, was a human brain. There were dozens of them, a veritable museum of stolen minds. And at the end of the room, in the last container, a human brain, still pink and fresh, pulsed with a faint rhythmic light. It was a mind that had been recently harvested. Antoine's breath caught in his throat. It was Jean-Pierre's brain. He knew it was. The collector's macabre collection had come to life. The faint rhythmic light was the flicker of life, of a captured, imprisoned consciousness. The collector was not just a murderer, he was a torturer. He was keeping the minds alive in a state of perpetual silent agony. A new, chilling voice, a quiet, scholarly voice echoed from the back of the room. A magnificent collection, is it not? The collector, a different man from the one who had screamed at the sight of his ruined journals, emerged from the shadows. He was calm, collected, and more terrifying than ever. He wasn't alone. Behind him was the brute, Gaspard, and a new face. A man, dressed in the uniform of a National Guard officer. A man of authority, of power. "I have been waiting for you," the collector said, his eyes fixed on them with a cold, predatory gleam. "I knew you would be drawn here. Curiosity is a difficult itch to ignore. And now that you have seen my life's work, my entire purpose, you will understand the gravity of your actions." The National Guard officer, a man with a rigid, humorless expression, stepped forward. "This is the last time you will interfere," he said, his voice clipped and cold. "You have seen too much. You know too much." The conspiracy was bigger than they ever imagined. It reached into the highest echelons of the revolutionary government. The collector wasn't just a madman working in the shadows. He was a puppet master, pulling the strings of power, using the revolution as a stage for his horrific play. They were no longer just two people against a madman. They were two people against a society, a silent, macabre society that was devouring the city from the inside out. Their fight for justice had just become a war for survival. The National Guard officer, whose name was Lieutenant Henri Desjardins, was a man of cold efficiency. His presence alone was more menacing than 100 thugs. He represented the new authority of Paris, and his involvement confirmed Antoine and Elise's worst fears. The collector's influence was not a fringe element, but a deeply embedded malignancy within the very heart of the revolution. "You have two choices," Desjardins said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You can disappear, your deaths attributed to the ongoing chaos. Or you can confess to being enemies of the people, spies for the monarchy, and be executed publicly. Either way, this ends here." "There is a third option," Antoine said, his voice shaking but his eyes fixed on Desjardins. "You can listen to us. This man is a monster. He is not a man of the revolution. He is a predator. He is using this city's fear to harvest people's minds." Desjardins simply scoffed. "A madman's fantasy. The people are being executed for treason. Their heads roll to pay for their crimes." "Their heads," Elise interjected, her voice sharp with a new fury, "are being taken by his device, the one with the serpent's fang. He is not executing them. He is dissecting them. He is stealing their knowledge. He is building an army of stolen minds." The collector, who had remained silent, now spoke. "A beautiful and poetic summary, my dear. But who would believe it? You, a mere seamstress, and your apprentice friend. The people are hungry for justice, for spectacle. They see what they want to see. And what they want to see is traitors losing their heads, not a scientist's collection." He was right. In the current climate of paranoia and violence, their story would be dismissed as the ramblings of two fearful citizens, perhaps even as a plot to undermine the revolution itself. Their only hope was to find proof, undeniable evidence that would expose the collector and his network. Antoine's eyes fell upon a small leather-bound book on the collector's desk. It was an unassuming little thing, but a bookmark was sticking out of it. It wasn't just any bookmark. It was a small, intricately carved wooden figure of a serpent, the same one from the drawing. It was a key. With a sudden burst of desperation, Antoine grabbed the book, his heart pounding. "He's not a madman," he said, holding up the book. "He's a conspirator. He's been planning this for years. This book, this is his ledger. The names, the dates, the locations. It's all in here." The collector's calm facade finally cracked. He lunged for the book, his eyes wide with panic. "Give it to me," he shrieked. "You don't know what you're holding." Gaspard and Desjardins moved to stop Antoine, but Elise, with a swift and determined move, kicked a shelf of glass beakers. The glass shattered, the chemicals inside creating a cloud of pungent, acrid smoke. The fumes were not lethal, but they were disorienting and painful to the eyes. Gaspard and Desjardins coughed and recoiled, their hands going to their faces. In that brief moment of chaos, Antoine and Elise bolted for the back of the apothecary. They didn't run towards the street, where they would be easily captured, but deeper into the building towards the back rooms. They found a small, hidden cellar door, barely visible beneath a pile of old rugs. They slid it open and dropped into the darkness below. The cellar was cold and damp, a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. They heard the furious shouts from above, the sound of the door being kicked in, and the muffled cries of the collector. They were safe, for now, but they had the ledger. They made their way through a network of old wine cellars, their path illuminated by the dim, flickering light of their small lamp. The cellar led to a series of interlocking tunnels, old smuggling routes that had been used for centuries. This was the city's secret underbelly, a world of shadows and forgotten histories. They finally emerged from a manhole cover in a desolate, abandoned alleyway. They were far from the apothecary, but the city's streets were still a dangerous place. They had to find a place to hide, a place where they could examine the ledger without fear of being discovered. They found a small, abandoned carriage house, its doors locked and its windows boarded. It was a perfect hiding spot, a place where they could be invisible. Inside, they finally had a moment to breathe, to examine the book. The ledger was not a simple list of names. It was a meticulous record of the collector's work. It contained the names of his victims, the dates of their disappearances, and the skills he had harvested from them. Mind of a master architect, mind of a master shipbuilder, mind of a master engineer. The list was long and chilling. It was a record of a silent, systematic purge of the city's most brilliant minds. And at the end of each entry, a series of codes indecipherable to them, but clearly a record of his work. The ledger also contained a list of names, not of victims, but of conspirators. There was Desjardins, the National Guard officer. But there were other names, names of prominent citizens, members of the National Assembly, even a high-ranking member of the Committee of Public Safety. The collector's influence was not just a thread in the city's fabric. It was the entire loom. The ledger was not just a book. It was a weapon. It was the key to exposing the entire conspiracy. But to whom could they turn? The very people they could have trusted were on the list. The revolution, the very thing that was supposed to bring justice, was a tool in the hands of a madman and his silent, powerful society. Their only ally was each other. They had to find a way to get this information out, to the people, to the world. But how do you expose a conspiracy that is using the very power of the state to hide its existence? Suddenly, a loud banging on the door of the carriage house shattered the silence. "Open up! We know you're in there!" a voice bellowed. It wasn't Gaspard or Desjardins, but the voice of a common thug, a lackey from the collector's network. They had been found. Their brief respite was over. They were trapped once again, in a city of traps, with a ledger that could save or damn them. The sound of the banging on the carriage house door was a grim symphony of impending doom. Antoine and Elise exchanged a look of frantic desperation. They were trapped. They had to act, and they had to act now. "The windows," Elise whispered, her eyes fixed on the small, boarded-up openings. Antoine grabbed a heavy iron pry bar he found on the floor, and with a few powerful heaves, managed to loosen one of the boards. A sliver of light, a small crack in their confinement, appeared. Just as they were about to scramble out, the door to the carriage house splintered inward, and Gaspar, his face a contorted mask of fury, burst through, his bludgeon raised. He was no longer a simple thug. He was a vengeful, driven monster. "You ruined his work," Gaspar growled, his voice a low, guttural rumble. "You will pay for that, I will make sure of it." As Gaspar lunged, Antoine, with a quick, desperate movement, pulled the pry bar out of the window frame and swung it at the thug's legs. Gaspard, caught off balance, stumbled and fell, his head hitting the hard cobblestone with a sickening thud. He lay still, his eyes closed. He was either dead or unconscious, and Antoine didn't stop to find out. "Let's go," he said, his voice a tight, strangled whisper. They scrambled through the narrow window, pulling the ledger with them. They were out, but they were still in the open. They couldn't run. They couldn't hide. The city was a maze of eyes and ears, and the collector's reach was long. They had to find a way to use the ledger, to expose the truth, to turn the very chaos of the revolution against its puppet master. They ran towards the city's center, a place of constant movement and noise, a place where they could get lost in the crowd. Their destination was the Place de Grève, the very heart of the revolution, the place where the guillotine stood as a symbol of justice. As they ran, Antoine had a sudden terrible thought. The collector's purpose. It wasn't just about preserving minds, it was about creating a perfect mind, a new kind of human being. He was using the harvested minds, the collective genius of the city, to build a superior intellect, a godlike consciousness for himself. And the great device, the guillotine with the serpent's fang, was not a tool for extraction, but a device for fusion. He was going to merge the minds, to create a single, powerful and terrifying being. The idea was so monstrous, so audacious, that it made a horrible kind of sense. He wasn't just a collector, he was a madman with a messianic complex. He was going to become the new mind of Paris, a silent, all-knowing entity that would control the city from the shadows. They reached the Place de Grève just as a new execution was about to begin. The crowd was a sea of people, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and revolutionary fervor. The atmosphere was thick with tension and anticipation. Antoine and Elise, with the ledger clutched in Antoine's hand, pushed their way through the crowd, their eyes scanning for a familiar face, a person they could trust. They found one, a young, idealistic journalist named Etienne, a friend of Antoine's who had always been a fierce advocate for truth and justice. "Etienne!" Antoine shouted, his voice hoarse from running. Etienne turned, his face a mask of surprise. "Antoine, Elise, what are you doing here? It's too dangerous." "We have to talk to you," Elise said, her voice urgent. "We have to tell you something. It's about the guillotine, about the executions. It's all a lie." Etienne, a man who believed in the power of words, listened intently as Antoine, in a series of breathless, frantic sentences, told him the story of Jean-Pierre, the collector, the apothecary, and the ledger. He told him about the great device and the conspiracy that reached into the highest echelons of the revolutionary government. Etienne's eyes, at first skeptical, grew wide with horror as he heard the story. He took the ledger, his hands trembling as he turned the pages, his gaze fixed on the names and the horrifying descriptions of the collector's victims. This is insane," Etienne whispered. "This is a conspiracy of a magnitude I never thought possible. We have to get this out. We have to tell the people." But as he spoke, a new voice, a voice they knew all too well, cut through the noise of the crowd. "There they are. The spies, the enemies of the people." Desjardins, his face a grim mask of righteous fury, stood on a small platform near the guillotine. He pointed a finger at Antoine, Elise, and Etienne. "They are monarchist conspirators. They seek to undermine the revolution. They have a book, a ledger, filled with the names of our loyal citizens, a list of traitors they seek to protect. Seize them." The crowd, a fickle and violent beast, turned on them. The shouts of "Liberté" and "Égalité" were replaced with the furious cry of traitors, spies, to the guillotine. The mob, a human wave of rage and betrayal, surged toward them. Antoine and Elise were caught in the crush, the weight of the crowd a suffocating, terrifying force. Etienne, with the ledger still in his hand, was separated from them, his face a mask of terror. He was not a fighter. He was a man of words, and he was being swallowed by the very mob he had tried to enlighten. The mob was relentless, a tide of humanity that cared nothing for truth or justice, only for blood. They were at the mercy of the city, a city that had been poisoned by a madman's ambition. The ledger, their only weapon, was in danger of being lost, of being destroyed, of being forgotten in the ensuing chaos. Their final, desperate act to expose the truth was about to become their public execution. The mob was a monstrous entity, a swirling vortex of human rage that consumed everything in its path. Antoine and Elise were separated from Etienne, pushed and pulled by the sheer force of the crowd. The ledger, their only weapon, was lost in the tumult, torn from Etienne's hands and trampled underfoot. Antoine, seeing Etienne go down, felt a surge of cold, focused rage. He was not just fighting for his life, he was fighting for the truth. He was fighting for Jean-Pierre, for all the nameless, faceless victims of the collector's monstrous ambition. He had to get to Etienne, to retrieve the ledger, to finish what they had started. He fought his way through the crowd, his mind a singular focus. He saw Desjardins and a small group of National Guardsmen, their eyes fixed on the chaos, their faces a mask of cold satisfaction. They had won. They had used the mob, a tool far more effective than any bludgeon or sword, to silence the truth. But as he fought, Antoine felt a small, determined hand grab his arm. It was Elise. Her face was bruised, her clothes torn, but her eyes were filled with a fierce, unyielding resolve. She pointed to a small, hidden alleyway, a brief sanctuary from the maelstrom. "The guillotine," she shouted over the roar of the crowd. "It's a distraction. He's not here. The great device. It's the heart of his plan." She was right. The public execution was a spectacle, a theatrical performance designed to keep the public's attention while the real horror was happening in the shadows. The collector wouldn't be here. He would be at his lab, preparing for his final terrible experiment. They fought their way out of the mob, scrambling into the alley. They were bruised and battered, but they were alive. They had lost the ledger, but they still had the knowledge. They knew the truth, and they knew where the collector was. They ran, not towards the city center, but towards the abandoned Paris asylum, the very place where this all began. They had to get back to the great device. They had to destroy it. It was their only hope of stopping the collector's plan, of ending his reign of silent terror. They crept through the dark tunnels, a grim path they now knew all too well. The silence was heavier this time, the air thick with a sense of finality. The thrumming sound, the low, mechanical heartbeat of the great device, was now a constant, powerful roar. They emerged into the cavernous chamber. The scene was a tableau of horrifying precision. The collector, his face a mask of manic excitement, stood before the device, a series of tubes and wires connected to his head. He was preparing for the final sacrament, the fusion of 1,000 minds. He was not alone. Desjardins and Gaspard, their clothes torn and their faces streaked with grime, stood beside him, guarding the entrance to the chamber. The collector, lost in the fever of his work, didn't notice them. "This is it," Elise whispered, her voice filled with a quiet terror. "He's doing it. He's going to become a god." Antoine looked around the chamber, his eyes scanning for a weapon, a tool, anything they could use to stop him. His gaze fell upon the intricate, beautiful, and terrifying mechanisms of the great device. It wasn't just a machine for evil, it was a testament to a monstrous genius, and like all machines, it had a weakness. He grabbed a heavy, rusty mallet, a tool of a forgotten artisan, and with a swift, determined movement, he brought it down on a series of gears near the base of the machine. The metal shrieked in protest. a terrible grating sound that filled the chamber. The collector's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and rage. "No! What are you doing?" he shrieked. "You fools! You are destroying a masterpiece. You are destroying the future." Desjardins and Gaspard charged, their faces contorted with rage. Elise, seeing them coming, grabbed a heavy, empty flask and hurled it at Desjardins. The glass shattered against his head and he staggered, momentarily stunned. Gaspard, meanwhile, lunged at Antoine, his bludgeon swinging. Antoine dodged the blow, and with a powerful swing, brought the mallet down on another series of gears. The machine shrieked, the thrumming sound changing to a desperate, dying groan. The tubes and wires connected to the collector's head began to spark and hiss, the viscous liquid in the glass cylinder swirling with a violent, terrifying energy. The collector, his face a mask of pure terror, clawed at the wires and tubes, trying to disconnect himself. But it was too late. The machine, a thing of terrible beauty, was dying, and it was taking him with it. A final, brilliant flash of light filled the chamber, followed by a deafening roar. The great device, the culmination of a madman's life's work, imploded, its intricate mechanisms tearing apart in a cataclysm of light and sound. The glass cylinder shattered, and the viscous liquid, the collective minds of 1,000 victims, spilled across the floor, a dark, viscous stain that was slowly absorbed by the cold, damp stone. The chamber was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the smoldering ruins of the great device. The silence was absolute, a profound and final silence that replaced the chaos and the horror. When their eyes adjusted to the darkness, they saw them. The collector, his body charred and his face a mask of 1,000 silent screams. Desjardins, his body broken, lay motionless on the ground. And Gaspard, his face pale and his eyes wide with a final horrified terror, was dead. They were all dead. Their monstrous conspiracy a ruin, a dark and terrible secret that was now buried beneath the city. Antoine and Elise, bruised and battered but alive, stood in the wreckage of a madman's dream. They had done it. They had stopped him. They had defeated a monster who had hidden in plain sight, a man who had used the city's chaos as a cover for his own private and terrible revolution. They had not saved the world, but they had saved a small part of it. They had won, but their victory was a somber one. They were alive, but the world they knew was gone forever. They had a new understanding of the city, of the revolution, of the nature of humanity itself. And that was a truth that was far more terrifying than any ghost or monster. The silence in the cavernous chamber was absolute, a heavy blanket that muffled the distant sounds of the city above. Antoine and Elise stood amidst the wreckage of the great device, the air still thick with the acrid scent of burnt metal and the lingering coppery smell of the spilled liquid. The collector and his conspirators were dead, their grotesque secret buried with them. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The horror of what they had witnessed, the sheer, unimaginable audacity of the collector's plan, was too vast for words. They had seen the true face of the revolution, a face of opportunism and madness, a face that had used the public's thirst for justice as a cover for its own private and monstrous ambition. As dawn painted the sky a pale gray, a faint rhythmic sound began to filter down from the tunnels above. It was the sound of a drum, a pre-dawn drum, a signal that a new day of justice, or rather, a new day of executions was about to begin. The city was still in a fever, and their truth, the truth of the collector's macabre collection, would never be believed. The ledger was gone, lost to the mob. Their story was too outlandish, too terrifying to be accepted. It would be dismissed as a lie, a madman's fantasy. They knew they couldn't stay. The network of tunnels was a dangerous place, and the collector might have had other people, other allies who would come looking for him. They had to disappear, to vanish into the city's shadows, to become a part of the unwritten history. They made their way back through the labyrinthine tunnels, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. They emerged from the manhole cover in the deserted alleyway, A different pair of people than the ones who had entered the day before. Their innocence was gone, replaced by a grim, sobering knowledge of the world. They walked through the city, unnoticed, a part of the throng of people who were already beginning to gather for the day's spectacle. The city was a character in this story, a vast, beautiful and terrifying stage for a silent, unseen horror. The people cheered, they celebrated, they reveled in the bloodshed, never knowing that they were not just spectators, but accomplices and victims. They reached a small, forgotten square near the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, the very place where this all began. They were home, in a sense, but their home was no longer the safe, familiar place it once was. It was a place of ghosts, of forgotten memories, of a truth that was buried under a mountain of lies. "What do we do now?" Antoine asked, his voice raw with a mixture of exhaustion and grief. Elise looked at him, her eyes filled with a new kind of wisdom, a kind that only comes from staring into the abyss. "We live," she said, her voice a quiet, determined whisper. "We live, and we remember. We remember Jean-Pierre. We remember the names on that ledger. We remember the price of knowledge and the price of silence." They made a pact, a silent agreement to never speak of what they had seen, of the truth they had uncovered. Their story would be a part of the city's unwritten history, a grim footnote in the annals of a violent, tumultuous era. They would continue to live their lives, to work, to love, but they would always carry the weight of their secret. They were the last witnesses to a truth so terrible it had been banned from the history books before it was even written. Antoine returned to his printing shop, the smell of ink and paper a comfort in a world of madness. He would continue his work, but his pamphlets would now carry a new, more profound message. They would speak of the importance of memory, of the danger of blind fanaticism, of the silent, unseen monsters that walk among us. Elise returned to her atelier, her hands now crafting not just fine lace, but a silent testament to the resilience of the human spirit. She would continue her work, her needle and thread weaving stories of courage, of defiance, of the quiet heroes who fought their battles in the shadows. The revolution continued, the guillotine at the Place de Grève claiming more and more heads. The city, a beautiful, monstrous thing, continued to turn, its gears grinding on a foundation of blood and lies. The collector's dream was a ruin, his legacy a pile of smoldering metal and spilled fluid. But his philosophy, his idea of a new kind of power, lived on, a silent whisper in the city's heart. Antoine and Elise, the last witnesses, would live out their lives, their bond forged in the fires of terror and the crucible of truth. They were not just a printer's apprentice and a seamstress. They were the keepers of an unwritten history, the silent chroniclers of a terror that was not supernatural, but horrifyingly, profoundly, and irrevocably human. They had faced the darkness and survived, and in doing so, they had become a part of the story. A story that would never be told, but would be remembered forever in the silent, haunted recesses of their minds.